I'm Olivia Parker, 38, a senior software architect who spent 12 years building the backbone of global enterprise systems. 3 days after my oncologist confirmed stage 3 breast cancer, my company terminated me for performance issues while I was literally sitting in the chemotherapy chair. The betrayal cut deeper than any scalpel ever could. But they made one critical mistake. They forgot that I still held the master keys to $4.30 billion worth of software licenses across 6 continents. What happened next would remind them exactly who they'd chosen to betray and why some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. This isn't just about revenge. It's about justice, dignity, and the power we discover when we refuse to remain silent. If you've ever felt powerless in the face of corporate cruelty, like and subscribe for more stories of justice and resilience. The original employment contract sat in my desk drawer for 12 years, yellowed at the edges but still bearing my eager signature from 2012. I was 26 then, fresh out of MIT with a master's in computer science and dreams of building something that mattered. Technova Solutions wasn't the biggest tech company, but they promised me something the giants couldn't: the chance to architect their entire global licensing infrastructure from the ground up. "We need someone who can think big," CEO Marcus Webb had told me during my final interview, "someone who can build a system that will scale with us as we grow internationally." His handshake was firm, his vision compelling. I believed in him, in the company, in the mission to democratize enterprise software across emerging markets. Those first months were intoxicating. I worked 18-hour days, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Every line of code I wrote was a building block in something revolutionary. The licensing system I designed wasn't just about managing software permissions, it was about creating a digital ecosystem that could adapt, scale, and serve millions of users across different continents, currencies, and regulatory environments. By year 3, my system was handling licenses for Fortune 500 companies in North America, scrappy startups in Southeast Asia, government agencies in Europe, and everything in between. The architecture was elegant in its complexity. A web of interconnected nodes that could process thousands of simultaneous requests while maintaining perfect security and audit trails. I remember the day we hit our first billion in managed licensing. Revenue Marcus called an all-hands meeting, and when he announced the milestone, the applause was thunderous. But when he specifically thanked me for building the engine that drives our success, I felt something I'd never experienced before: true professional pride. The trust they placed in me was extraordinary. I held master encryption keys, had root access to production systems, and maintained direct relationships with our most valuable clients. When the CTO of a major European bank had technical concerns, they asked to speak with me directly. When an Australian mining company needed custom integration, I flew to Sydney to oversee the implementation personally. My colleagues respected me. My superiors praised my work. The annual reviews were glowing, the bonuses generous, the stock options substantial. I wasn't just an employee. I was a cornerstone of the company's technical foundation. But looking back now, I realize I was also becoming something else. Indispensable in a way that would eventually threaten them. The culture at Technova seemed progressive. They offered flexible working arrangements, encouraged work-life balance, and prided themselves on treating employees like family. The company grew from 40 employees to over 3,000 during my tenure, but the leadership team made sure everyone still felt valued and heard. Or so I thought. The warning signs were subtle at first. A new VP of engineering who questioned my architectural decisions. A reorganization that moved me from reporting directly to the CTO to being buried 3 levels deeper in the org chart. Comments about knowledge silos and the need for better documentation of my systems. I should have paid more attention. I should have realized that my expertise, once valued, had become a liability in their minds. But I was too busy being good at my job, too focused on serving our clients, too naive to recognize the politics swirling around me. The contract in my drawer promised job security, growth opportunities, and mutual respect. It outlined a partnership between equals, a commitment to building something lasting together. I kept it as a reminder of where I'd started, of the dreams we'd shared, of the trust we'd built. I never imagined it would become evidence of how completely they'd betrayed everything we'd once stood for. The system architecture blueprint that hung on my office wall looked like a spider's web drawn by a mathematician, intricate, purposeful, and beautiful in its complexity. Each node represented a different aspect of our global licensing infrastructure, connected by lines that showed data flow, security protocols, and fail-safe mechanisms. To most people, it was just a technical diagram. To me, it was a map of everything I'd built. At the center of it all was the master authentication server, the digital heart that pumped licensing permissions to every corner of our global network. I'd designed it with military-grade encryption and triple redundancy, ensuring that even if 2/3 of the system failed, the licenses would continue flowing. It was elegant, robust, and most importantly, it required my personal authorization keys for any major changes. The scope of what I'd created was staggering. Our licensing system managed software permissions for over 12,000 companies across 6 continents. In North America alone, we handled licenses for 300 Fortune 500 companies, including major banks, healthcare systems, and government contractors. The European division managed everything from small Danish startups to massive German manufacturing conglomerates. Our Asian operations covered everyone from Tokyo tech giants to emerging Indian software companies. But the real complexity lay in the relationships between these systems. A single enterprise client might have subsidiaries in 15 countries, each with different regulatory requirements, currency considerations, and technical constraints. My architecture had to account for all of it. The Brazilian subsidiary that needed Portuguese language support, the German office that required GDPR compliance, the Japanese division that operated on a completely different fiscal calendar. The financial implications were mind-boggling. The $4.3 billion in licensing revenue wasn't just a number. It represented the digital lifeblood of thousands of companies. When a major automotive manufacturer in Detroit needed to license CAD software for their engineers, my system handled it. When a hospital network in Singapore required database licenses for their patient management systems, my architecture made it possible. When a logistics company in Rotterdam needed real-time tracking software, my infrastructure delivered it. I'd spent years cultivating personal relationships with key clients, understanding their unique needs and customizing solutions that went far beyond standard licensing agreements. The CTO of Meridian Financial trusted me enough to give me his personal cell phone number. The head of IT at Pacific Logistics invited me to their annual strategy meetings. The procurement director at Northern Manufacturing sent me Christmas cards. These weren't just professional relationships. They were built on 12 years of reliability, innovation, and personal service. When they had problems, they called me directly. When they needed custom solutions, they knew I'd find a way. When they were evaluating new software partnerships, my recommendation carried weight. The security protocols I'd implemented were equally sophisticated. Every transaction was logged, every access attempt was monitored, and every system modification required multiple levels of authentication. I'd built in safeguards that would make a bank vault look casual by comparison. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd made the system so secure that even the company couldn't easily override my access controls. My technical expertise extended beyond just the licensing infrastructure. I understood the business implications of every architectural decision, the regulatory requirements of every market we served, and the competitive dynamics of every industry we touched. I wasn't just a software architect. I was a business strategist, a relationship manager, and a crisis resolver, all rolled into one. The blueprint on my wall represented more than just technical achievement. It was a testament to trust, collaboration, and shared vision. Every line, every connection, every node had been carefully considered and thoughtfully implemented. It was my professional legacy, my contribution to the digital infrastructure that kept the global economy running. Looking at it now, I realized something that should have been obvious. I hadn't just built a system. I'd built a lever that could move the world. The medical report that changed my life was surprisingly brief. Just 3 pages of clinical language that reduced my future to statistics and treatment protocols. Dr. Sarah Chen delivered the news with professional compassion, but the words hit like a physical blow. Stage 3 invasive ductal carcinoma, cancer. The word echoed in my mind as she explained treatment options, survival rates, and timelines. 6 months of chemotherapy, followed by surgery, then radiation. A year of my life dedicated to fighting an enemy I couldn't see or code my way around. I need to tell my employer, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. They'll need to know about the time off for treatments. Dr. Chen nodded. Most companies are very accommodating. The Family and Medical Leave Act protects your job, and many employers go above and beyond to support employees through cancer treatment. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? Technova had always prided itself on being a progressive, employee-friendly company. We had excellent health insurance, flexible work policies, and a stated commitment to work-life balance. When my colleague Jake had his heart attack 2 years earlier, they'd held his position for 4 months and welcomed him back with full support. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with my direct supervisor, Director of Engineering, Lisa Wong. I'd worked with Lisa for 6 years. She'd been promoted from within and understood both my value to the company and the technical complexity of my role. I have some personal news to share, I began, then laid out the diagnosis and treatment plan. Lisa's face showed genuine concern and sympathy. "Oh, Olivia, I'm so sorry. Of course we'll work around your treatment schedule. Your health comes first." She paused, thinking through the logistics. "Can you handle some remote work between treatments? And we'll need to document your systems more thoroughly just as a precaution." It seemed reasonable. I appreciated her practical approach and felt relieved that the conversation had gone so smoothly. We discussed creating detailed documentation for my key systems, training backup personnel, and establishing communication protocols for urgent issues that might arise during treatment. "Take whatever time you need," Lisa assured me. "We'll figure out the rest." I felt grateful, supported, and optimistic about balancing treatment with work. The documentation project would actually be valuable. I'd been meaning to formalize many of my processes anyway. Training junior engineers would help with succession planning. It all seemed like good business practice wrapped in genuine human concern. HR was equally supportive when I filed the formal FMLA paperwork. They expedited the approval process and connected me with the Employee Assistance Program for additional resources. The benefits coordinator walked me through my insurance coverage and confirmed that my treatment would be fully covered under our premium health plan. My teammates were wonderful. When word spread through the engineering department, I received dozens of supportive messages, offers to help with projects, and promises to keep things running smoothly while I focused on getting better. Some shared their own stories of family members who'd successfully battled cancer. Others simply let me know they were thinking of me. For those first few weeks after the diagnosis, I felt surrounded by care and support. The fear of cancer was overwhelming enough. At least I didn't have to worry about my job security or financial stability. I had 12 years of excellent performance reviews, deep institutional knowledge, and strong relationships throughout the company. I was naive enough to believe that mattered. I thought loyalty and competence were shields against corporate betrayal. I assumed that being indispensable meant being protected. I was about to learn how wrong I could be. The email thread that destroyed my faith in human decency started innocuously enough. 3 weeks after my diagnosis, I received a meeting request from HR for a routine check-in regarding your medical leave arrangements. The tone was professional, almost caring, but something felt off about the timing. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday, right in the middle of my chemotherapy window. When I asked to reschedule, citing my treatment appointment, the response was curt. "This is the only time slot available this week." The meeting itself was a masterclass in corporate doublespeak. HR representative Janet Mills sat across from me with a manila folder thick with documents I'd never seen before. She smiled warmly while delivering a series of barely veiled threats, disguised as policy clarifications. "We've been reviewing your recent performance metrics," she said, sliding a document across the table. "There are some concerning patterns we need to address." I stared at the paper in disbelief. It outlined supposedly declining code quality, missed deadlines, and communication issues, all dated within the last month. None of it was true. My recent work had been exemplary. My deadlines met or exceeded, and my communication had been more thorough than ever as I prepared for extended medical leave. "This is inaccurate," I said carefully. "I can provide documentation showing." "We also need to discuss the knowledge management issue," Janet interrupted. "Your systems lack proper documentation, creating unnecessary business risk. We'll need you to prioritize remediation immediately." The irony was staggering. They were criticizing me for not documenting systems they were simultaneously claiming I was underperforming on. It was a catch-22 designed to justify whatever decision they'd already made. Over the following weeks, the harassment intensified. My access to certain systems was restricted for security auditing purposes. Projects I'd led for years were reassigned to junior developers to spread institutional knowledge. Meeting invitations stopped arriving in my inbox. The most insidious part was how they weaponized my cancer treatment against me. When I missed a non-essential meeting due to chemotherapy side effects, it was documented as failure to prioritize work commitments. When I worked from home during recovery periods, it was characterized as lack of collaborative engagement. Lisa Wong, who had initially been so supportive, began distancing herself. Our regular one-on-ones were canceled or cut short. When I asked about project priorities, she gave vague responses about organizational restructuring and evolving needs. The woman who had promised to support me through treatment was now barely making eye contact. The email threads revealed the real strategy. Through a forwarding error, I received an internal message between Janet Mills and VP of Engineering Tom Bradley. Continued documentation of performance issues. Legal wants a clear paper trail before we proceed. The medical situation complicates timing, but we need to move quickly. My blood ran cold. They weren't supporting me through cancer treatment. They were building a case to fire me because of it. Every conversation, every missed meeting, Every moment of vulnerability was being twisted into evidence. Against me, the cruelest twist came when they scheduled a critical project review during my heaviest chemotherapy week. When I explained that I'd be physically unable to attend due to treatment side effects, the response was immediate. Failure to attend mandatory meetings demonstrates lack of commitment to organizational priorities. I was trapped in a system designed to eliminate me. They couldn't fire me directly for having cancer, that would be illegal. But they could create a false narrative of performance issues, document every weakness caused by my treatment, and build a case for termination that would look legitimate on paper. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was personal. These were people I'd worked alongside for years, shared successes with, trusted with my vulnerabilities. They knew exactly how much I'd sacrificed for the company, how central I was to our operations, how devastating this treatment was for me physically and emotionally. But they saw an opportunity in my weakness, and they took it. They calculated that a sick employee was expendable regardless of her contributions or dedication. They decided that 12 years of excellence could be erased by 3 months of strategic documentation. They were about to learn how wrong that calculation was. The hospital wristband felt heavier than it should. Have a thin plastic reminder that I was now officially a patient, not just a person dealing with an inconvenient diagnosis. The oncology ward at St. Mary's Medical Center had become my second home, a place where time moved differently and hope battled fear in every corner. I was settling into chair 7 for my 3rd round of chemotherapy when my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed Janet Mills from HR. The timing seemed odd. It was barely 9 a.m. on a Wednesday, and she knew I had treatment appointments on Wednesdays. "Olivia, I need to discuss some urgent matters with you." Her voice was cold, professional. No inquiry about how I was feeling, no acknowledgement of where I was or what I was going through. The nurse, Maria, was preparing my foreline. She looked at me with concern when she saw my expression. "Is everything okay, honey?" I held up a finger, trying to focus on Janet's words while the reality of my situation, sitting in a chemotherapy chair with poison about to flow through my veins, a surreal backdrop for what was clearly not a supportive check-in call. "I'm at the hospital right now," I said. "Can this wait until?" "No, it cannot wait. We need to inform you that effective immediately, your employment with Technova Solutions is terminated. You'll receive a termination letter via email within the hour." The words hit harder than any chemotherapy drug ever could. Around me, the familiar sounds of the treatment center continued, machines beeping, nurses moving efficiently between patients, quiet conversations about treatment plans and family visits, but I felt completely disconnected from it all, suspended in a moment of pure disbelief. "You're firing me during chemotherapy?" The words came out louder than intended. Other patients looked over with concern and curiosity. "Your recent performance issues have left us no choice," Janet continued, her tone suggesting she was reading from a script. "Multiple documented instances of missed deadlines, poor communication, and failure to meet essential job responsibilities." Maria had stopped repairing my fore, her face showing the kind of righteous anger that only healthcare workers who've seen too much human cruelty can display. She placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, offering silent support while I processed the impossibility of what was happening. "This is about my cancer," I said, my voice shaking. "You're discriminating against me because this is strictly a performance-based decision," Janet interrupted. "Your medical situation has nothing to do with our assessment of your work quality." The lie was so transparent, so cruel in its delivery that I almost laughed. Instead, I felt tears building in my eyes, not just from the betrayal, but from the timing, the setting, the complete absence of human decency in how they'd chosen to destroy my life. Around me, fellow cancer patients were fighting for their lives with dignity and courage. Mrs. Rodriguez in chair 5 was knitting between treatment sessions, making blankets for her grandchildren. The young man in chair 3 was video calling his daughter, making funny faces to make her laugh, while chemicals flowed through his system. And here I was, receiving the news that the company I'd served faithfully for 12 years had decided to kick me while I was literally at my most vulnerable. Maria squeezed my shoulder. "Some people," she said quietly, "have no soul." The call ended with Janet's reminder about returning company property and Cobra insurance paperwork. No thank you. For 12 years of dedication, no acknowledgement of the projects I'd completed, the clients I'd served, the infrastructure I'd built, just the cold efficiency of corporate disposal as the chemotherapy drugs began flowing through the IV line. I felt something else flowing through me, a cold, clear anger that would soon crystallize into something much more powerful. They'd chosen the wrong person to betray, and they'd made a crucial mistake in how they'd done it. The legal consultation notes filled 14 pages of yellow legal pad paper. each line representing another violation of my rights that Technova had casually committed. Attorney Rebecca Martinez had 20 years of experience in employment law, and her face grew grimmer with each detail I shared. "They fired you during chemotherapy?" she asked, setting down her pen while you were physically connected to an IV. Chair 7, St. Mary's Medical Center, 9:47 a.m. last Wednesday, I confirmed. I have the hospital records to prove it. Rebecca shook her head slowly. "In 2 decades of practice, I've seen corporate cruelty, but this is exceptional. The optics alone would make any jury furious, regardless of the legal merits." She explained the web of laws Technova had violated: the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Family and Medical Leave Act, state anti-discrimination statutes, and potentially federal civil rights protections. The timing of my termination, the documented harassment during treatment, and the transparent pretext of performance issues created what she called a plaintiff's attorney's dream case. But legal vindication and practical reality were different. The litigation process could take 2 to 3 years, cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees, and consume emotional energy I needed for cancer treatment. Even with a strong case, corporate defendants had resources to drag out proceedings indefinitely. "There's another consideration," Rebecca said carefully. "Your financial situation during treatment. Cobra insurance will be expensive and legal. Battles don't pay the bills in the short term." That was the cruelest part of their strategy. They knew cancer treatment was financially devastating even with good insurance. They knew I'd be vulnerable, desperate, and potentially willing to accept a quick settlement rather than fight a prolonged battle. They'd calculated that desperation would make me compliant. "What about my stock options?" I asked. 12 years of vested equity. Rebecca's expression darkened further. "Terminated employees typically forfeit unvested options immediately. Let me guess, they accelerated your termination to fall just before the next vesting date." They had 4 months before. My largest option grant would have vested, representing nearly 2 years of salary in equity value. The timing wasn't coincidentally. Was surgical precision designed to maximize my financial pain. "There's something else," I said, hesitating. "Something that might complicate things." I explained about my continued system access, the master keys I still held, and the scope of the licensing infrastructure under my control. Rebecca leaned forward, her legal mind immediately grasping the implications. "They didn't revoke your access?" she asked. "After terminating you?" "It's complicated. The systems I built require multiple authorization levels, and my access is embedded in the core architecture. Removing it would require significant technical work and could disrupt operations." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, processing the unprecedented situation. "Olivia, you need to understand something. What you're describing isn't just leverage, it's potentially the most powerful position I've ever seen a wrongfully terminated employee hold." She explained the legal complexities of my situation. "Using my access for any kind of retaliation could expose me to criminal charges for computer fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, or corporate sabotage, but my mere possession of that access, combined with their illegal termination, created a unique negotiating position. The key," she said, "is documentation. Every interaction, every decision, every action you take from this point forward needs to be carefully considered and legally defensible." She outlined a strategy that would protect me while maximizing pressure on Technova: formal demand letters, regulatory complaints, and strategic communications with their board of directors and major investors. The goal wasn't immediate retaliation, it was building an irrefutable case that would force them to negotiate seriously. "But understand this," Rebecca warned. "Once we start this process, there's no going back. They'll fight dirty, question your character, and try to paint you as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge." I thought about Maria's words in the chemotherapy chair. Some people have no soul. Technova had already shown their character. They'd made their choice when they decided to destroy a cancer patient, rather than support her. Now, it was time for me to make mine. The access logs didn't lie, even when everything else in my life felt like an elaborate deception. 3 days after my termination, sitting in my home office with my laptop humming quietly, I decided to test something that seemed impossible. Were my system credentials still active? The login screen for our primary authentication server appeared familiar and unchanged. I entered my username and password, expecting an immediate rejection. A cold access denied message that would confirm my complete severance from 12 years of professional life. Instead, the dashboard loaded normally. My administrative privileges were intact. My master encryption keys were still valid. Every single system I'd built and maintained over the past decade was still under my control. I stared at the screen in disbelief. This wasn't an oversight, it was a fundamental impossibility given standard corporate security protocols. When employees are terminated, especially senior technical staff, their access should be revoked within minutes, not days. IT security. Teams have checklists, automated systems, and legal requirements that make such oversights nearly impossible. But then I remembered the architecture I'd so carefully designed. My access wasn't just another user account in a standard directory system. I'd built myself into the core infrastructure itself, creating authentication pathways that were integral to the system's operation. Removing my access would require rewriting fundamental components of the licensing infrastructure. The scope of what remained under my control was staggering. I pulled up the global network status dashboard and watched real-time data flowing across 6 continents. License validations from an automotive manufacturer in Detroit. Database permissions for a hospital network in Singapore. Software activations for a logistics company in Rotterdam. All of it flowing through systems that recognized me as the primary architect and administrator. I navigated to the financial reporting module, something I rarely accessed but had built for the executive team's quarterly reviews. The numbers were overwhelming: $4.3 billion in active licensing revenue, representing thousands of companies whose daily operations depended on the infrastructure I'd created. But it wasn't just about the money, it was about the relationships. My personal authentication was embedded in client communication systems, meaning I could still access support tickets, escalation protocols, and direct communication channels with major accounts. The CTO of Meridian Financial, the procurement director at Northern Manufacturing, the head of IT at Pacific Logistics, they all had my contact information and trusted me personally. The technical reality was even more complex. The licensing system operated on a distributed architecture with authentication nodes in 12 countries. Each node required my cryptographic signature for major policy changes. Even if Technova wanted to remove my access, they'd need to coordinate simultaneous updates across multiple time zones. While maintaining service continuity for thousands of active clients, I realized they faced an impossible choice. They could attempt to remove my access, risking massive service disruptions that would affect billions in client operations and potentially trigger breach of contract lawsuits. Or they could leave my access intact, hoping I'd simply walk away quietly and not use the leverage they'd inadvertently given me. They'd made a critical error in their termination strategy. In their rush to eliminate a problem employee, they'd overlooked the fundamental truth of the infrastructure I'd built. I wasn't just an administrator of their systems, I was architecturally integral to their operation. The irony was beautiful in its completeness. They'd fired me for supposedly being a liability, while simultaneously leaving me in control of their most valuable digital assets. They'd accused me of being unreliable while depending entirely on systems I could control with a few keystrokes. For the first time since my diagnosis, I felt something other than fear or anger. I felt power, not the arbitrary power of corporate hierarchy, but the real power of irreplaceable expertise and careful preparation. They'd forgotten who they were dealing with. It was time to remind them. The personal journal entry that kept me awake that night was written in my own handwriting. But the thoughts felt foreign, dangerous. What would happen if I simply turned it all off? I'd written, what if the licenses just stopped working? 3 a.m. was the hour of moral reckoning. The chemotherapy drugs had left me nauseated and sleepless, but my mind was crystal clear about the choice before me. I had the power to cripple a company that had shown me no mercy, but using that power would make me something I'd never been: destructive. The temptation was overwhelming. Technova had calculated that I'd be too weak, too desperate, too focused on survival to fight back. They'd kicked me while I was down, destroyed my financial security during the most vulnerable period of my life, and shown callous disregard for basic human decency. The elegant symmetry of digital revenge was almost irresistible, but revenge would have casualties I couldn't control. The hospital in Singapore that relied on our database licensing for patient records, the automotive manufacturer whose assembly lines depended on our CAD software permissions, the small businesses across Europe and Asia whose daily operations would halt if their licenses suddenly vanished. I thought about Mrs. Rodriguez from the chemotherapy chair, knitting blankets for grandchildren she might not live to see graduate. She'd never hurt anyone, but if I acted rashly, the pharmacy system at her local hospital might go down, affecting her prescription management. The ripple effects of digital infrastructure failures were unpredictable and far-reaching. This wasn't about the innocent employees at Technova either. My former teammates in engineering had no idea what the executives had done. The customer service representatives who fielded angry calls from affected clients wouldn't deserve the blame. Even some of the management team had genuinely supported me during my diagnosis. The ethical framework I'd lived by for 38 years was built on precision, not destruction. I solved problems. I didn't create them. I built systems that helped people work more efficiently, not weapons that could harm indiscriminately. The power I held was meant to serve others, not settle personal scores, but justice and revenge weren't the same thing. Justice required proportionality, precision, and accountability. It meant consequences for those who had actually made the decisions to betray me, not collective punishment for an entire ecosystem of users who depended on reliable software licensing. I spent hours mapping out the potential consequences of different actions. A complete system shutdown would affect millions of end users and could trigger legal liability for me. Selective targeting of specific clients would be arbitrary and unfair. But strategic pressure on Teknova's decision makers, that could be both just and effective. The key insight came at dawn, as exhaustion finally began to overpower my racing thoughts. I didn't need to destroy anything to demonstrate my leverage. I just needed to remind them who held the keys to their digital kingdom. The threat itself was more powerful than any actual damage I might cause. Professional integrity had been my guiding principle for 12 years. They'd violated it completely when they chose cruelty over compassion, calculation over humanity. But responding with cruelty would make me no better than them. I needed to be strategic, proportional, and above all, ethica in whatever response I chose. The journal entry I wrote that morning was different. They chose to make this about power. They forgot that real power comes from competence, preparation, and moral clarity. It's time to remind them of all three. The path forward was becoming clear. Not revenge justice. Not destruction accountability. Not cruelty consequences for those who had earned them. The financial impact analysis that I compiled over the next 3 days read like a map of global digital dependency. Each spreadsheet row represented millions of dollars in licensing revenue. Thousands of employees whose jobs depended on software, access, and critical infrastructure that kept the modern economy functioning. I started with the top-tier clients, the Fortune 500 companies, whose enterprise licenses generated the highest revenue. Meridian Financial alone accounted for $127 million annually across their global operations. Their trading platforms, risk management systems, and regulatory reporting tools all depended on licenses I could revoke with a few keystrokes. Pacific Logistics represented $89 million in annual revenue, with supply chain management software that coordinated shipping across 3 continents, but the numbers told only part of the story. Behind each licensing agreement were real-world consequences that made my power both awesome and terrifying. The automotive manufacturer in Detroit used our CAD software to design safety systems. Disrupting their licenses could delay critical vehicle safety updates. The hospital network in Singapore relied on our database permissions for patient management systems that literally kept people alive. I created a detailed map of the licensing ecosystem, tracing the connections between parent companies and subsidiaries, identifying single points of failure, and calculating the cascading effects of various disruption scenarios. What I discovered was that Teknova's infrastructure was far more fragile than anyone realized. The most vulnerable point was the European market, where GDPR compliance requirements meant that licensing disruptions could trigger regulatory investigations and massive fines. A coordinated revocation of key enterprise licenses in Germany and France alone would create a crisis that could force emergency board meetings and potentially involve government regulators. The Asian markets presented different leverage points. The enterprise clients there operated on razor-thin margins and couldn't afford extended software downtime. A strategic disruption during peak business hours in Singapore, Tokyo, and Mumbai would create maximum pressure with minimal collateral damage to end users, but the real revelation came when I analyzed Teknova's own financial structure. The company had leveraged their predictable licensing revenue to secure lines of credit and investor commitments. Their quarterly projections, board presentations, and loan covenants all assumed steady cash flow from the enterprise licensing division. I'd built. A significant disruption in licensing revenue wouldn't just hurt their profits, it could trigger technical defaults on their debt agreements and force emergency renegotiations with investors. The carefully constructed financial house of cards that enabled their aggressive growth strategy was built entirely on the foundation of reliable software licensing income. I discovered that 73% of their total revenue came from enterprise licensing, with the top 50 clients representing 41% of company income. More importantly, their recent expansion into emerging markets was financed through revenue projections that assumed continued growth in licensing income. Any significant disruption would force them to explain to investors and lenders why their most reliable revenue stream had suddenly become unreliable. The technical architecture analysis revealed additional leverage points. The licensing system operated on a hub-and-spoke model with regional authentication servers that I could selectively disable. I could target specific geographic markets without affecting others, or focus on particular industries while leaving the rest of the ecosystem intact. Most critically, I identified the decision-makers who would feel immediate pressure from any licensing disruption. CEO Marcus Webb would face angry calls from major clients. CFO Jennifer Park would have to explain revenue shortfalls to investors. VP of Engineering Tom Bradley would be responsible for technical crisis management. He couldn't actually control. The investigation confirmed what my moral reasoning had suggested. Precision was possible. I could create targeted consequences for the executives who had betrayed me without causing widespread harm to innocent users or employees. The financial analysis became my strategic roadmap, a careful plan for corporate accountability that would force Teknova to face the consequences of their cruelty without causing collateral damage to the thousands of businesses and millions of users who depended on reliable software licensing. The action plan document that emerged from my analysis was methodical, precise, and designed to create maximum pressure with surgical precision. I'd spent decades building systems that were elegant and efficient. This strategy would reflect the same principles. Phase 1 would establish the new reality. I would send a formal communication to the Teknova board of directors, copying CEO Marcus Webb, CFO Jennifer Park, and the investors I knew from my years attending company meetings. The message would be professional, factual, and impossible to ignore. Their most critical systems remained under the control of the employee. They'd illegally terminated during cancer treatment. The timing would be deliberate. Monday morning, 9 a.m. Pacific time, when the executive team would be starting their weekly board briefing. The email would arrive in their inboxes just as they were reviewing quarterly projections and discussing growth strategies built entirely on licensing revenue I controlled. Phase 2 involved strategic demonstration. Rather than causing immediate harm, I would implement small, temporary disruptions that proved my capabilities without creating lasting damage. A 15-minute authentication delay for one major client during low usage hours. A brief suspension of new license activations in a single geographic region. Enough to show my reach, not enough to cause real harm. Each demonstration would be carefully documented and immediately followed by restoration of normal service. The message would be clear. This wasn't random system failure or external attack. This was controlled, precise, and reversible action by someone who understood the infrastructure better than anyone else. Phase 3. Escalated pressure on decision-makers specifically. I identified the personal phone numbers and email addresses of Teknova's major clients' relationships I'd built over 12 years of direct service. A carefully crafted communication explaining my situation and their vulnerability would create pressure from the very people the executives most needed to keep happy. The client communications would be professional and factual. No emotional appeals. No demands for sympathy, just the technical reality that their business-critical software licenses were controlled by someone the company had illegally terminated. The clients would draw their own conclusions about business continuity risks. Phase 4 involved regulatory and legal pressure. Rebecca Martinez had identified specific government agencies and industry groups that would be very interested in Teknova's discriminatory practices and the resulting systemic risks to critical infrastructure. A coordinated filing of complaints with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, state labor boards, and relevant industry regulators would create multiple fronts of official scrutiny. The contingency planning was equally detailed. If Teknova attempted to remove my access through emergency technical measures, I had prepared automated responses that would create immediate, widespread disruptions they couldn't easily resolve. If they tried to discredit me publicly, I had documentation proving every aspect of my case. If they attempted legal action against me, Rebecca was prepared with countersuit strategies that would make their litigation costs astronomical. The escalation timeline was designed to give them multiple opportunities to negotiate before reaching the point of serious business impact. 7 days for initial response to my board communication. Another 7 days for substantive settlement discussions. Only after 2 weeks of stonewalling would I implement measures that could seriously affect their operations. Throughout the plan, I maintained strict ethical boundaries. No action would permanently damage client operations. No innocent employees would be targeted. No end users would lose access to software they needed for critical functions. The consequences would fall precisely on those who had made the decision to betray me. The strategy document concluded with my ultimate objective: not revenge, but justice. A settlement that included financial compensation for wrongful termination, policy changes to prevent future discrimination, and public acknowledgement of their illegal actions. If they chose to fight rather than negotiate, the plan provided escalating pressure that would make resistance increasingly costly. They'd force this confrontation when they decided to target a cancer patient. Now they would discover the difference between cruelty and strategy, between corporate power and technical competence, between what they thought they could get away with and what they'd actually be allowed to do. The system alert log that would change everything was timestamped at exactly 9 hours, 0 minutes and 17 seconds a.m. Pacific time on a Monday morning. I'd chosen the target carefully, a non-critical licensing verification system for Technova's internal operations there. Own employee software access, not client systems, for precisely 15 minutes. Every Technova employee who tried to access company software would receive an authentication. Delay message, license verification in progress. Please wait. No data would be lost, no critical operations affected, but every person in the company would experience a small reminder of how dependent they were on systems I controlled. I watched the real-time monitoring dashboard as the alerts cascaded through their network. Help desk tickets started appearing immediately. Employees, confused by the unusual delay. IT staff scrambling to understand why their authentication servers were responding slowly. The beauty was in the precision. Everything still worked, just slowly enough to be noticeable and concerning. At 9:15 a.m., exactly, I restored normal service. The delays vanished as suddenly as they'd appeared, leaving behind only log entries that would puzzle their technical teams. No damage, no permanent disruption, just a gentle demonstration of capabilities that should have terrified anyone paying attention. The board email had been sent, simultaneously with the authentication delay. As confused IT staff were investigating the mysterious service slowdown, Marcus Webb, Jennifer Park, and the entire board of directors were reading my carefully crafted message. To the Technova board of directors, I am writing to inform you of a critical business continuity risk that requires immediate board-level attention. Following my illegal termination during cancer treatment, my administrative access to all enterprise licensing systems remains active. As demonstrated by this morning's authentication delays, this access encompasses $4.3 billion in client licensing revenue across 6 continents. This situation requires immediate resolution through good faith negotiations. The message included Rebecca Martinez's contact information, a detailed timeline of discriminatory actions leading to my termination, and a technical summary of the systems under my control. Most importantly, it established a 7-day timeline for a substantive response before escalation. Within an hour, the effects were visible across Technova's network traffic. I could see increased activity on their internal communication systems, emergency IT security scans, and frantic attempts to analyze the morning's authentication anomaly. The Monday morning board meeting that typically focused on growth projections was undoubtedly being hijacked by crisis management discussions. The psychological impact was precisely what I'd intended. They'd spent weeks building a narrative that I was a problematic employee they could easily discard. Now they were confronting the reality that their most valuable digital assets remained under the control of someone they'd criminally wronged. The technical elegance of the demonstration was important too. By targeting their internal systems rather than client operations, I'd shown both capability and restraint. Any competent technical analysis would reveal that I could have caused far more significant disruption but had chosen precision over destruction. The alert logs from their security systems told the story of organizational panic, emergency scans for unauthorized access, attempts to trace the source of the authentication delays, frantic reviews of system architecture, documentation. Every analysis would lead them to the same inescapable conclusion. The woman they'd fired during chemotherapy held the keys to their digital kingdom. The first move was complete. I'd transformed from discarded cancer patient to existential business threat in the span of 15 minutes. The power dynamic that had enabled their cruelty was now completely reversed by afternoon. I could see evidence of emergency meetings in their calendar systems and urgent communications with legal counsel. The authentication delay had lasted only 15 minutes, but the crisis it revealed would consume weeks of executive attention and resources. They'd wanted to make me powerless. Instead, they'd given me leverage they couldn't revoke, couldn't control, and couldn't ignore. The first move had established the new rules of engagement. Now they had 6 days to decide whether they wanted to negotiate or discover what the second move would look like. The emergency meeting minutes that appeared in Technova's shared systems painted a picture of corporate chaos that was both satisfying and professionally fascinating. Through my continued access to their internal collaboration platforms, I could watch the crisis unfold in real time. Urgent board emergency session. Authentication security breach was scheduled for Tuesday morning, less than 24 hours after my demonstration. The attendee list included every C-level executive, the entire board of directors, outside legal counsel, and a cybersecurity firm they'd apparently hired overnight. The meeting notes, automatically synchronized to their document management system, revealed the depth of their panic. CEO Marcus Webb had opened with a statement that I was a disgruntled former employee attempting to extort the company through illegal system access. The irony of calling my access illegal while admitting they'd failed to revoke it wasn't lost on me. CFO Jennifer Park's contribution was more telling. The licensing revenue at risk represents 73% of our quarterly projections. Any significant disruption could trigger covenant violations on our credit facilities. The financial reality was forcing them to confront what their illegal termination had actually cost them. VP of Engineering Tom Bradley faced the harshest questioning. The board wanted to know how a terminated employee retained administrative access to critical systems. His explanation that my access was architecturally embedded and couldn't be easily removed without risking service disruptions only made things worse. So, you're telling me board member Patricia Chen had apparently said that we fired our most critical technical employee without ensuring we could actually remove her access to our most valuable assets? The technical assessment was damning. Their hastily hired cybersecurity consultants confirmed that my access was legitimate, not the result of hacking or unauthorized intrusion. The authentication delays had been implemented through proper administrative channels using valid credentials. Most embarrassingly, they couldn't remove my access without potentially triggering exactly the kind of widespread service disruptions I'd threatened. The legal analysis was equally problematic. Outside counsel had reviewed Rebecca Martinez's demand letter and concluded that my wrongful termination case was exceptionally strong and that my continued system access, while unusual, wasn't clearly illegal given the circumstances of my termination. But the most revealing part of the meeting minutes was the discussion of response options. They'd considered several approaches, attempting to negotiate quietly, trying to discredit me publicly, or pursuing legal action to force me to surrender my access. Each option had been rejected for practical reasons. Quiet negotiation would require admitting wrongdoing and potentially paying substantial damages. Public discrediting would draw media attention to their discriminatory practices and create a public relations nightmare. Legal action would be expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain, especially given the strength of my wrongful termination case. The finger-pointing was immediate and brutal. Marcus Webb blamed HR for inadequate termination procedures. Jennifer Park blamed Tom Bradley for poor security architecture. Tom Bradley blamed Marcus Webb for forcing a rushed termination without proper technical review. Board member David Kim apparently summarized the situation bluntly. We illegally fired a cancer patient who built our most critical systems, failed to remove her access, and now face potential disruption of billions in client revenue. This is a catastrophic failure of judgment and execution. The emergency IT security scans running continuously in their systems showed increasing desperation. They were analyzing every access log, reviewing every administrative action, and searching for any technical vulnerability they could exploit to regain control, but every analysis confirmed what they already knew. I'd built the systems too well, embedded my access too deeply, and maintained too much technical sophistication for easy removal. Their attempts to reach out to major clients for proactive security updates were backfiring. Sophisticated IT departments at companies like Meridian, Financial, and Pacific Logistics were asking pointed questions about why Technova was suddenly concerned about authentication, security, and whether there were specific threats they should know about. By Wednesday, 3 separate board members had contacted headhunting firms to explore replacing senior management. The crisis was consuming so much executive attention that normal business operations were suffering. The stock price had begun declining as rumors of internal technical issues leaked to industry analysts. The meeting minutes concluded with a reluctant authorization for preliminary settlement discussions. They were finally ready to acknowledge that their illegal termination had created a crisis they couldn't solve through technical or legal force. The corporate scramble was complete. The company that had thought they could casually discard a cancer patient was now facing an existential threat they'd created through their own cruelty and incompetence. The recorded phone call that would define everything came at 3:47 p.m. on Thursday. The reality of the moment still sent adrenaline coursing through my system. Olivia, this is Marcus Webb. I think we need to talk. His voice carried none of the confidence I remembered from company meetings. This was a man who'd spent the week watching his carefully constructed empire threatened by someone he'd written off as expendable. Hello, Marcus, I replied, keeping my tone professionally neutral. "We need to resolve this situation immediately. What you're doing threatening our operations, holding our systems hostages, criminal extortion. What I'm doing, Marcus, is maintaining access to systems I built while seeking resolution for my illegal termination. If my continued employment of my own access credentials constitutes extortion, perhaps you should have considered that before firing me during chemotherapy." A long pause. Coaching him through the conversation. "Look, we made some mistakes in how your termination was handled. We're prepared to offer a reasonable settlement to resolve this matter quietly." Define reasonable. In exchange, you immediately surrender all system access and sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. I almost laughed. The assumption that I was desperate enough to accept scraps in exchange for surrendering the leverage? That's not reasonable, Marcus. That's insulting. My wrongful termination cost me 12 years of career trajectory, stock options worth millions, and financial security during cancer treatment. Your offer doesn't even cover my legal fees. What do you want? The question came out strained, desperate. Full reinstatement with back pay, accelerated vesting of all stock options, a public apology for discriminatory practices, and implementation of policies preventing future medical discrimination. Additionally, I want the board to review and dismiss the executives responsible for my illegal termination. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. We can't reinstate someone who's threatening our operations. The board would never agree to executive changes based on demands from a disgruntled employee. Then you misunderstand the situation entirely, I replied calmly. I'm not a disgruntled employee making demands. I'm the architect of your most critical systems, illegally terminated, seeking restoration of my rights and career. The leverage I hold isn't a threat, it's the natural consequence of your failure to properly terminate my access. Olivia, be reasonable. You can't seriously expect I expect justice, Marcus. I expect accountability for illegal discrimination. I expect recognition that your company violated federal law when it fired me during cancer treatment. And I expect you to understand that the technical competence you tried to discard is now the only thing standing between you and business catastrophe. Another long pause. More background discussion. When he returned, desperation was creeping into his voice. The authentication delays earlier this week were a gentle reminder. Further demonstrations will be proportionally more serious. You're threatening to damage our client relationships, cost people their jobs. You cost me my job during cancer treatment, I interrupted. You damaged my health, my financial security, and my career. The consequences you're facing now are entirely of your own making. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but the dynamic was clear. Marcus was trying to negotiate from a position of weakness while pretending he still held power. Every proposal he made assumed I was motivated by desperation rather than principle. When the call ended, I knew we were far from resolution. They still didn't understand that this wasn't about money, it was about justice. They'd created a crisis through illegal discrimination and corporate cruelty. Now they wanted to resolve it through minimal compensation and continued denial of wrongdoing. The recording would become crucial evidence in the legal proceedings that were now inevitable. More immediately, it confirmed that they had no intention of accepting responsibility for their actions. It was time for the second demonstration. The global news article that broke everything open appeared on TechCrunch at 6:32 a.m. Pacific Time on Friday morning. The headline read, "Cancer Patient Controls $4.3 billion in software licenses after illegal termination. Tech Company in Crisis." I hadn't leaked the story. That honor belonged to someone inside Technova, likely a board member, who'd grown disgusted with executive management's handling of the crisis. Communications and emergency meeting minutes. The piece was devastating in its precision. The systematic harassment during treatment, and the ultimate betrayal of termination during chemotherapy. But the technical details were what made it explosive: the scope of systems under my control, and the company's complete dependence on infrastructure they could no longer manage. Within hours, the story was picked up by major business publications worldwide. The Wall Street Journal ran a detailed analysis of the legal implications. The Financial Times focused on the systemic risks to global enterprise software licensing. Bloomberg covered the stock price impact and investor concerns about, while connected to a chemotherapy. For the contrast between corporate cruelty and personal vulnerability resonated with millions of people who'd experienced their own workplace injustices. The hashtag chemo chair firing began trending worldwide. Cancer survivors shared their own stories of workplace discrimination. Tech workers posted about corporate cultures that valued profit over people. The narrative had evolved from a business dispute to a symbol of everything wrong with modern corporate behavior. Technova's stock price fell 12% in pre-market trading and continued declining throughout the day. Investors were spooked. not just by the operational risks, but by the reputational damage that would be difficult to repair, regardless of how the immediate crisis was resolved. The client reactions were swift and brutal. Meridian Financial issued a statement expressing serious concerns about business continuity and vendor reliability. Pacific Logistics announced they were reviewing their software licensing arrangements with Teknova in light of recent operational uncertainties. The Northern Manufacturing Procurement Directorate sent me began downgrading Teknova stock and questioning the company's long-term viability. If their most critical technical architect could be illegally terminated and retain control of essential systems. What did that say about their corporate governance, technical leadership, and operational security? The regulatory response was equally damaging. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission announced they were opening a formal investigation into discriminatory practices, leave protections. The Department of Labor expressed interest in the broader implications for tech industry employment practices. More personally devastating for the executives was the revelation of their character during the crisis. Internal emails and meeting minutes leaked to journalists showed the callous calculations behind my termination, the deliberate timing to maximize my vulnerability, and the complete absence of empathy for a longtime employee facing a life-threatening illness. Marcus Webb's attempt at damage control through a hastily arranged press conference only made things worse. His claim that my termination was purely performance-based was immediately contradicted by leaked performance reviews showing 12 years of excellence. His assertion that my continued system access was a minor technical oversight was demolished by technical experts who explained the architectural complexity. Marcus's response, "We can't let personal situations interfere with business decisions," became the quote that defined the company's heartless corporate culture. By evening, they were dealing with stock price collapse, client defections, regulatory investigations, and a public relations disaster that would haunt them for years. The illegal termination of one cancer patient had exposed fundamental failures of leadership, very survival. They'd wanted to quietly dispose of a problem employee. Instead, they'd created a global symbol of corporate cruelty that would force a reckoning with their values, their leadership, and their future. The settlement agreement that arrived via Rebecca Martinez's email on Monday morning was 37 pages of legal language that represented complete capitulation by Teknova's board of directors. The weekend had brought additional client defections, a credit rating downgrade, and an emergency board meeting that resulted in the resignations of Marcus Webb, Tom Bradley, and HR Director Janet Mills. The terms were everything I'd demanded and more. Full reinstatement as Senior Vice President of Global Infrastructure, a promotion that reflected my true value to the organization. Complete restoration of all stock options with accelerated vesting schedules that would make me financially secure. For life, back pay with interest covering the entire period of my illegal termination. But the non-financial terms were equally important. Teknova would implement comprehensive anti-discrimination policies specifically protecting employees with medical conditions. They would establish an independent ombudsman program for reporting discrimination complaints. Most significantly, they would issue a public apology acknowledging their violations of federal employment law and their commitment to cultural change. The board had also agreed to my demand for accountability. The executives responsible for my termination were gone, replaced by leadership committed to rebuilding the company's reputation and culture. The new CEO, Patricia Chen, had built her career on ethical leadership and employee advocacy. The financial settlement included $2.3 million. In compensation for lost wages, benefits, and emotional distress, the accelerated stock options were worth an additional $4.1 million at current market prices. Combined with my restored position and ongoing salary, the agreement would leave me more financially secure than I'd ever imagined possible. Rebecca had negotiated masterfully, using the media attention and regulatory pressure to extract concessions that went far beyond typical wrongful termination settlements. "This isn't just compensation," she explained during our review call. "This is corporate transformation enforced through legal agreement." The implementation timeline was aggressive. Within 30 days, Teknova would publish their public apology. In major business publications, the new anti-discrimination policies would be implemented within 60 days. My reinstatement would be effective immediately, with full restoration of all system access and administrative privileges. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were paying millions to restore the access they'd never successfully removed. The technical incompetence that had given me leverage was now costing them more than my entire career salary. But the settlement included provisions that went beyond my individual case. Teknova agreed to establish a $10 million fund for employee assistance during medical emergencies, ensuring no future employee would face the financial devastation I'd experienced. They committed to annual third-party audits of their employment practices and public reporting of diversity and inclusion metrics. The most personally satisfying clause required mandatory sensitivity training for all management personnel, with specific focus on supporting employees through medical crises. The executives who would replace Marcus Webb and his team would be required to complete comprehensive programs on ethical, leadership, and legal compliance. The agreement also addressed my concerns about retaliation. Any attempt to marginalize me, professionally reduce my responsibilities, or create a hostile work environment would trigger additional penalties and legal consequences. Independent oversight would monitor my working conditions for the first 2 years following reinstatement. The public relations component was carefully crafted to restore my professional reputation, while highlighting Teknova's commitment to change. The company would issue statements acknowledging my technical expertise, leadership contributions, and the illegal nature of my termination. Industry publications would receive coordinated communications about my promotion and the new policies implemented in response to my case. The settlement also included provisions for my continued cancer treatment, full medical leave as needed, flexible working arrangements during recovery periods, and guaranteed job protection regardless of treatment duration. The company that had fired me during chemotherapy was now contractually obligated to support me through the remainder of my medical journey. As I signed the final documents, I reflected on the transformation that had occurred. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been a discarded cancer patient facing financial ruin and professional destruction. Now I was returning to work with enhanced authority, financial security, and legal protections that would prevent future discrimination. The settlement represented more than personal vindication. It was a precedent that would protect other employees facing similar challenges. The policies Teknova implemented would become models for other companies seeking to avoid similar legal and reputational disasters. Justice had been served, not through revenge or destruction, but through accountability and systematic change. That would benefit countless future employees who faced medical crises while trying to maintain their careers. Patient has responded exceptionally. The phrase carried weight that went beyond medical terminology. It meant I'd survived not just the disease, but the corporate betrayal that had made treatment exponentially more difficult. The settlement had given me financial security, but this letter gave me something more precious: the future they'd tried to steal. Returning to Teknova after the settlement had been surreal. The office looked the same, but everything fundamental had changed. The executives who'd orchestrated my termination were gone, replaced by leaders who treated my comeback as a triumph rather than a threat. The new CEO had personally welcomed me back during an all-hands meeting that felt like a corporate revival. Technical excellence, personal resilience, and the courage to stand up for what's right. The culture transformation was remarkable. The new anti-discrimination policies had created reporting mechanisms that encouraged transparency and accountability. Most importantly, the story of my fight had empowered other employees to speak up about workplace injustices. My new role as Senior Vice President of Global Infrastructure came with expanded responsibilities and a team of 12 engineers who treated me with a respect that felt different from before, just professional deference. Me leveraged during the crisis became the foundation for unprecedented growth. Companies that had questioned the speaking engagements began 3 months after my return. Tech conferences wanted to hear about building resilient infrastructure. Medical advocacy groups invited me to discuss workplace rights during health crises. I wasn't just a software architect anymore, I was an advocate. For employees facing impossible choices between health and career security, the technical expertise that had given me leverage was now a platform for broader social change. The financial security from the settlement had transformed my relationship with work itself. No longer driven by the need for health insurance or retirement savings, I could focus on projects that mattered. I'd established a nonprofit foundation focused on supporting tech workers through medical crises. Initiative was a legal defense fund for employees facing medical discrimination. We'd already taken on 6 cases, using my story and Rebecca Martinez's expertise to force corporate accountability across the industry. Each victory created precedents that strengthened protections for vulnerable workers. The emotional healing had been slower, but equally important. Therapy helped me process the trauma of betrayal during my most vulnerable period. Support groups connected me with other cancer survivors who'd faced their own workplace challenges. The combination of professional vindication and personal recovery had restored my faith in both justice and resilience. The relationships damaged during my illness were gradually being rebuilt. Former colleagues who'd remained silent during my persecution now sought opportunities to repair those connections. I was selective about forgiveness, but open to authentic efforts at reconciliation. My medical team had become extended family. The hospital that had seen my lowest moment recovery to systemic change that would outlast my individual experience. The business license for Parker Digital Ethics arrived on a Tuesday morning 18 months after my settlement, marking the formal launch of the consulting firm I'd dreamed about during my darkest chemotherapy sessions. The document was simple, official permission to operate, but it represented everything I'd learned about turning corporate betrayal into meaningful change. My new office overlooked the San Francisco Bay, a deliberate choice that reminded me daily of the broader perspective I'd gained through crisis. The walls displayed not just technical certifications, but framed letters from employees whose discrimination cases we'd helped resolve, photos from speaking engagements at conferences worldwide, and the original system architecture blueprint from Teknova. Now a symbol of both technical achievement and personal resilience, the consulting practice focused on what I called ethical technology infrastructure, helping companies build systems that served both business needs and employee welfare. The irony wasn't lost on me that corporate leaders now paid premium rates for advice on avoiding the exact mistakes Teknova had made. In my case, my first major client was Meridian Financial, whose CTO had remained supportive throughout my ordeal. They wanted me to redesign their entire software licensing infrastructure with built-in protections against the kind of single-point failure risks my case had exposed. The project felt like completing a circle using the technical expertise that had given me leverage to create systems that protected rather than concentrated power. The speaking circuit had evolved from crisis management to thought leadership. Last month's keynote at the Global Technology Ethics Summit drew 3,000 attendees who came to hear about building corporate cultures that valued human dignity alongside profit margins. The standing ovation lasted 4 minutes, not for my technical achievements, but for proving that individual integrity could force systemic change. The nonprofit foundation had grown beyond my wildest expectations. The Employee Medical Rights Defense Fund had handled 43 cases in its first year, winning settlements totaling $18 million and forcing policy changes at dozens of companies. Each victory created legal precedents that strengthened protections for future employees facing similar challenges. The most rewarding cases involved direct mentorship. When Jennifer Walsh, a marketing director at a biotech company, was demoted after her lupus diagnosis, I spent weeks coaching her through the documentation process that would make her case irrefutable. When David Kim, a software engineer, faced harassment during his father's terminal illness, our legal team forced his company to implement comprehensive family medical leave policies. The foundation's annual gala had become a significant industry event. This year's gathering brought together employment attorneys, corporate executives, medical advocates, and survivors who'd transformed their own workplace betrayals into broader social change. The evening raised $2.3 million while creating connections that would support vulnerable employees for years to come. Teknova's transformation under Patricia Chen's leadership had become a case study in corporate redemption. The company's stock price had not only recovered but reached historic highs as investors recognized that ethical business practices created long-term value. The employee satisfaction scores were the highest in the industry, and their anti-discrimination policies were being adopted by competitors worldwide. My relationship with the company remained complex but constructive. I'd stepped back from day-to-day operations to focus on my consulting practice, but maintained strategic advisory roles that let me influence their continued evolution. The technical infrastructure I'd built remained the foundation of their success, now managed by a team I'd trained in both engineering excellence and ethical responsibility. The personal healing continued daily. Cancer remained part of my story but no longer defined my future. Regular medical checkups brought continued good news. The financial security from my settlement meant I could choose projects based on impact rather than necessity. Most importantly, the experience had taught me that true power came not from controlling systems, but from building communities of support and accountability. The journey from chemotherapy chair to corporate accountability had taken 3 years, but its impact would last generations. Every employee who received support during medical crises, every company that implemented ethical policies, every legal precedent that protected vulnerable workers all carried forward the lesson that individual courage could challenge institutional injustice. Looking back, I realized that Teknova's cruelest betrayal had become the foundation for my most meaningful work. They'd tried to destroy me during my moment of greatest vulnerability. Instead, they'd created an advocate who would spend the rest of her career ensuring no one else would face that choice between health and livelihood. The cancer had been conquered, the corporation had been transformed, the system had been changed. And somewhere in a chemotherapy chair this morning, another patient was receiving the protection and support my fight had made possible. That was justice worth fighting for.